Everything I learned in anger management. Hop back on some east side banning shit and push a nigga's top back when I let the cannon spit. Start planning shit, premeditation. I'm in love with the streets again, rededication. Casket or cremation when I shoot you.
You know, like I say, I came to prison with a life sentence in '96. But when I came to prison, even though I was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole, no one who had life was going home.
They weren't going home back then.
They was being systematically denied. And so at some point in time, they came up with these self-help groups. And so it was basically mandatory. It wasn't mandatory, but it was basically mandatory for the parole board, for anybody that had life. If you didn't take certain groups, you weren't going nowhere. Because after you take a group, they give you a chrono, which is basically a certificate of completion. And so I was always extremely impressed with a person who was taking a group who didn't have life, because that person was getting out regardless. And I must admit, if I didn't have life, I wouldn't have took one group. So I was always impressed with people who didn't have life, who were actually in the group to better themselves. That's awesome. You know, so how do you think those groups eventually, because I know at some point in time, we all, initially I believe we all, when we took those groups, we all kind of bucked against them. Oh, yeah, so at some point in time, once you started realizing, okay, well, some of these groups is helpful. What do you think? What was the most that you pulled from those groups? How did they help you when you were released?
Well, for one, I was able through AA and NA to process trauma, to process things.
What's AA and NA for those who may not know?
Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. I mostly went to AA, and through those programs, like they work at the prison I was at, they'd work a rigorous 12-step program, which means like you are fully engaged. You had a sponsor. You walked through the steps with them. A step 4 is like super like deep, like you are digging into yourself, you're working through past traumas, how it affected you, and what your part was. So like the idea of responsibility and accountability was completely foreign to me before I did that. Participating in other groups, like I was able to vision cast and decide what I wanted to do with my life. I'd never in my life thought about who I wanted to be outside of Casper and what I wanted to do that was good. And those groups allowed space for me to throw some ideas on the table, some of them good, some of them not. Right. But ultimately, through the process of these conversations with people, I was able to see that I want something more than just this limited existence that I was doing. And the most important thing I learned from those groups is the premise of toxic masculinity, because I figured out that that's what I'm doing. Like I'm modeling masculinity, I'm modeling what I think a man is supposed to be based on what society has told me it is.
And what are some of those things?
So, ability to be violent is one of those things. So the more violent you are, the more man you are. Objectification of women, that sounds super scientific, but basically if you can pull girls, then you're a dude, like you're one of those dudes, like you're a guy. If you can't fight and you can pull girls, you're good, right? Right. And then pursuit of money, like if I could get more money, that makes my status, that creates my status. And the reality of modeling that behavior, for one, in terms of masculinity, is super limited, because we have a full range of emotions that we're shutting off just to do those things, and we have a full range of needs and wants societally that we shut off so that we could do those things. And furthermore, we're harming people. We're harming women when we objectify them. We're harming others when we fight them or stab them or kill them or whatever it be. And the pursuit of money is such a dry game, right? Like none of those things really matter, and we place those as the pinnacle of what makes a man. And in challenging that and realizing that it's just a mask that I'm putting on, I was able to step outside and start emoting in a way, like working, talking with my wife, talking with my peers about things that I really wanted, things that really hurt me, that scared me, whatever, in a way where I didn't feel threatened, right? And I had never had that before in my life. I'd been modeling that shit since I was 14 years old. That allowed me to put down the gang mentality that I was living by, the racism that I was living by, drug addiction, everything. I was able to put all that aside and figure out where it came from and process it with a group of people just like me who were in prison and not be a threat for it. Like I was always worried that if I talked about feelings, makes you weak, right? That is not the case.
Right. So, and that's what I was going to say, because you mentioned toxic masculinity, and so in prison, how important is that, portraying this tough guy image, being macho, being willing to fight? Because I know being in prison, violence is something that you get accepted, regardless of what race, Crip, blood, white, black, Asian, Hispanic. If you're violent, you're respected, you're admired, you're feared. So how important was that in prison?
It is very important. What I did find through the process of going, through the educational steps and the deep introspection that it took for me to get to a point where I was challenging that, what I was able to find is it's not as important as people think. Like, I imagined that everybody would immediately turn on me the second that I stopped doing that shit. That was not the case, or at least for me. Maybe for some others it was the case, but what became more important to me was my top 5 was the people and the goals that I have in life. The top 5 people and the top 5 goals that I have in life. And if I was living for those things, I wasn't modeling that behavior, because that behavior hurt them.
Right.
And so once I started thinking like that, I didn't receive a whole lot of backlash when I stepped away from everything. There were people who didn't like me, who didn't fuck with me, whatever. I don't really care, because it wasn't about their image of respect. It was about my top 5. So, I mean, prison is a pretty brutal environment. They dress it like it's everything, but my belief firmly is that everybody is modeling that shit in there, and also everybody intuitively knows that that's not all that life is modeling that shit, right? And when you step outside of that, life becomes so much more rich and full. I mean, I couldn't imagine going back into that frame of thinking.
Right. And so what was it like? 'Cause like you said something that was extremely important. You said that as men growing up, we weren't pretty much allowed to talk about our emotions, or we'd be labeled this, we'd be labeled that, and this and that is basically weak. You're a punk, because we're supposed to stuff our emotions, not cry, you know, don't talk about things that hurt us. Man up. So what was it like in these groups to see some of these guys get up and say, hey man, you know what? I'm human too, man. It hurts me when XYZ happens, man. What was it like being able to see these, you know, these tough guys on the yard, maybe that you have been known for years, be able to come forward and say, hey man, I have emotions?
It was at first uncomfortable and then refreshing. And I think that that's the experience that other people have too. I can't speak for other people. I can speak for myself. First, it was a bit uncomfortable because when you put that stuff down deep inside, you blunt that shit and it doesn't grow. Like, you are stunting your emotional growth. But as you go forward in time, you start feeling refreshed, because you're like, I know this to be true, what this person is saying, and I feel the same. So that point of relation becomes everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I want to ask you this: during your time of incarceration, did you ever do time with any, you know, any so-called?
Dear God, please don't let me relapse and return to the evil that men do. Father God, I pray and ask that you help me to have mercy on others the same way I would want you.